Hello team, fourth time lucky. Welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. This is the Ukraine War news update, first part there off for the 31st of October. Oh, that is indeed a reference to it being Halloween. Words are difficult to come by today. If I stumble and fall, I'm going to pull out my blue card, which is in the UK. I get a disability badge for parking because I can't walk very well at all. I'm going to pull out my blue badge to say I blame my disability for my inability to talk properly today. So bear with me. I'm not the top of my game. Anyway, we're going to go to the Ukrainian general staff figures for the Russian losses for the day before. All the usual caveats apply. You can find them in the description to this video below. 870 personnel lost is a fairly high number, considering the range that we've seen over the course of the counteroffensive period. I don't know whether we can still call this counteroffensive period. It's a bit of a odd time. People are wondering whether the counteroffensive has indeed come to an end. Still, that's a large number of losses for the Russians, and we have some truly high figures going forward in some of these categories. So 21 tanks and 29 armoured personnel vehicles is another tough day for the Russians. That is a huge number of vehicles lost again, indicating that possibly the weather is on the up. We had seen a couple of quiet days. You could have put it down to the weekend, more likely down to the bad weather that we saw sort of Friday and Saturday particularly. Now up into the 20s, almost 30 armoured personnel vehicles lost is very high. 25 artillery systems, another high category. But wow, the next one, 10 multiple launch rocket systems lost. That is incredibly high. And as you can see from the stats there, we are used to about, I guess, just under 2 a day on average. So to lose 10 in a day is 5 times the average or more. 3 anti-aircraft warfare systems is also very high when you're used to losing about 1 a day. So that is a bad day for the Russians, certainly in those categories. 21 drones and 2 cruise missiles. They're predominantly going to be from the night before, I would have thought. Although 21 seems a lot higher than the overnight figures were yesterday, so I don't know how those figures are totted up. 35 vehicles and fuel tanks, that's a big loss to the Russian logistics, and 2 pieces of special equipment. So I think from a sort of intuitive point of view, that's a bad day for the Russians, and they have made taken some significant losses. Now, when we look at Andrew Perpetua's excellent summary of equipment loss totted up from what he sees on the socials, I think this is quite a different day because it's almost at parity, pretty much is at parity there, which is something we only occasionally see. The ratios have been pretty much 4 to 5, maybe 4 or 5 to 1 in terms of Russian to Ukrainian losses recently, sometimes even more than that. And yet today there's something approaching parity. Well, let's look at the types of stuff lost. So the Ukrainians have lost a Stormer. That is a short-range air defense missile system provided by the British. That is quite a loss, but it is only damaged by Lancet, so it depends whether that is fixable. Same with the electronic warfare station. And then we have a few boats thrown in, IEDs dropped from drones on those. A few tanks, the STR V122, that is destroyed. That is a bit of a loss because that's they don't have too many of those. That's a Leopard 2 provided, the variant provided by the Swedish. Yeah, a bit of a sore loss, that one. A couple of T-64s, and then onto a Bradley, M113. Yeah, those are much lower value stuff apart from the Bradley. Down to quite a lot of civilian vehicles there thrown in. So the Russians, as you can see, using their own drones quite capably. And it's not that the Ukrainians have some kind of asymmetrical advantage in capability. It's more likely to do with how many drones the Ukrainians can get their hands on compared to the Russians. Something like United 24 is a huge boon for the Ukrainians with the amount of money they've raised and the production of drones, both indigenously and abroad, to help. Excavator, TOS-1A, and I'll show you the TOS-1A in a second. That's a thermobaric launcher, so that's going to be a bit of a loss for the Russians there. Otherwise, a few tanks, T-72s, some IFVs, APCs, and a few trucks and civilian pieces of kit afterwards. So I think that's probably, I guess, there or thereabouts, different values. You know, the boats and the Stormer, the Leopard variant and the Bradley, those are bad losses for the Ukrainians, certainly. TOS-1A and just, I guess, heavier losses in terms of IFVs and APCs for the Russians means it's maybe slightly worse day for Ukrainians, or pretty much there or thereabouts in terms of parity. Here we have the TOS-1A getting taken out. I'm not going to show it to you other than it cooks off fairly effectively. That's in the Avdiivka direction, so that's good for the Ukrainians there. Those are pretty horrific vehicles, well, in terms of the munitions they fire off, although they're not particularly long range, I do believe. Right, just to continue talking about drones and capabilities of drones, a Ukrainian pilot, so this has come from The Economist, just a quote from there. The small FPV battlefield drones, first-person view battlefield drones, have challenged many accepted rules of war, and doctrine is struggling to adapt. Quote, "The future is already with us," says Genius, a deputy battalion commander in the 47th Brigade. I believe they are now fighting in Avdiivka. They've been brought up there to support the Avdiivka defense. In mid-October, a Ukrainian pilot set a 22-kilometer record for the distance at which he incapacitated a Russian tank, 18 kilometers behind the front line. So this is significant for a number of reasons. One, it shows that they have upped the range of first-person view loitering munition drones, and this means they can hit things way behind the lines. And two, what he goes on to say, his commander says that the Russians have imposed a 10-kilometer no-tank zone behind the front, which is interesting because it means that effectively tanks can't be used for what they're supposed to be used for. So unless one presumes they are being used for the assault, they have to keep them behind their own lines by 10 kilometers, due to the risk of being hit by loitering munitions. But then when you've now got loitering munitions that can double that range from 10-kilometer range up to 22 kilometers here, hitting 18 kilometers behind the front line, that will change the behavior of the Russian forces. And if they have to keep their tanks 20 kilometers behind the front line instead of 10 kilometers, then that really affects logistics, affects their ability to use these tanks effectively. This is, I think, pretty important. Now, the question is, how many of these longer range drones do the Ukrainians have access to? Do they have? I don't know, but we are hearing about them more and more. To continue, he says his commander says the Russians have imposed a 10-kilometer no-tank zone behind the front, dramatically decreasing the value of such weapons. Hummer says that his own forces have a 58% success rate in hitting targets. That's interesting because that's something I've wanted to know. We see so much footage online as to, things getting blown up, hit by these loitering munitions, and how many of those drones are successful. 58%, that's almost 60%, 6 in 10. That's not too bad. But, well, actually, I say that. I really don't know what I was expecting. Have no frame of reference. But the traffic is not one way. And the Ukrainians have many losses too. Russian FPV drones have destroyed several Bradley fighting vehicles, each worth some $2 million, and a Leopard tank. And in fact, when you look at Andrew Perpetua's losses here, when we look at everything that the Ukrainians have lost, you have, right, up until this point, from the bottom up to here, every single one is from a drone. A couple of unknown causes, then it's drone, unknown cause, ATGM, artillery. Okay, so 3 are known to not be drones. Only 3 out of all of the Ukrainians. Everything else might have been a drone or is an unknown. That is a huge change, as compared to the beginning of the war. Drones are becoming the new god of war, perhaps. Anyway, moving on to Dmitry from War Translated. saying a Russian instructor describes the assault methods of penal Storm Z units in Avdiivka who take significant losses due to being considered less valuable. He mentions irreversible losses to 40 to 70%. This is the Russian source here. Let's return to some of our sad circumstances. Storm Z assault detachments in the Avdiivka direction and the southern flank of Bakhmut. I don't know about other directions. Literally, in just a few days of active operations, are ground down to almost zero. On average, the level of irretrievable losses varies between 40 to 70%, and sanitary losses accordingly amount to about 60 to 30% of personnel. I mean, that is, with any NATO force, that would render them completely combat ineffective. And that means you have to adapt your planning as to how you use these groups. I mean, if you're going to say, right, you need to do X, and I'd expect X to be done by a fully combat effective group, 100% staffed group, I'd expect to be able to do that within 2 days. Well, then if I'm asking you to do it and you're down to 40% of your personnel, then that's going to affect my expectations of how quickly or efficiently or well you can do the task I'm setting you. Firstly, we have the problem of an insufficient level of training of personnel up to blatant situations when people are dressed and equipped rather poorly, given weapons and sent to the front line because of pressure. Secondly, a critical problem is a lack of proper artillery support for attacks and counterattacks, which in fact turn into those notorious meat assaults. Thirdly, there is a persistent practice of depriving assault detachments of the initiative in choosing options for carrying out the assigned combat mission, even in cases where detachment commanders are able to propose and implement such options. Fourthly, assault troops are often thrown into battle in an emergency mode, practically off the wheels, without being introduced to the situation and given time to conduct reconnaissance and establish interaction with adjacent units. Fifth, I mean, this is talking about, I could just imagine this. It's like, if NATO, the US Army, were going to do some big attack maneuver in a war zone, they would be briefing, serious briefing, intel collected. Everyone knows what they're doing. It's all your ducks are in a row. You've got your support from the air, you've got your artillery support, everyone's equipped with everything they're going to need, etc., etc. You're all well trained, so on and so forth. Everything is in place. I would imagine that's going to be your bare minimum, because troops are so valuable to the Americans and to NATO forces. When you look at what the Russians are doing, and they're drafting in convicts from prison, they're not training them properly, they're giving them really poor equipment. So poor training, poor equipment, and then poor knowledge, partly because actually the Russians don't have the ISR capabilities, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance capabilities, in terms of their satellites are poor and outdated and beyond their service service level agreements. That's not what I mean, but they're beyond their sell-by dates, basically up in orbit, so on and so forth. They don't have the ISR capabilities, and they don't, I would imagine they're not, well, according to this, they're not really briefing their troops either. So they're just literally taking these poorly equipped, poorly trained troops, putting them on IFVs, and then sending them into the battle zone and say, right, here's your gun, here's some ammo, go and shoot at Ukrainians. Now, hopefully that is somewhat accurate. I mean, this is what the Russians are saying themselves here, but we must remember that's not going to be the case all across the Russian armed forces. There will be very highly competent Russian units operating, such as in the Robotina area. But we are talking here about the Storm Z units that are the lowest valued units by the Russian armed forces. And this is fairly typical behavior as far as I can work out. Fifthly, the high level of irretrievable losses is due to objective difficulties in evacuating the wounded from the battlefield in conditions of predominance and even more so domination of enemy artillery. So not only are you going to throw them in ill-prepared, ill-equipped and ill-trained, but you're not going to give them the artillery support that the Russians have traditionally been used to, particularly at the beginning of the war, with huge barrages of artillery, flatten a place and then move your troops in. That's not the case anymore because there's been so much counter-battery fire and degradation of the Russian artillery from the use of drones, as well as I say, counter-battery fire and even HIMARS, that they don't have that artillery support, and this is what has been claimed here as well. So your troops then go in, have a tough time of it, and are perhaps very heavily degraded. You have units in need medevac, and you don't have the capability to get those troops out and given attention, and so the likelihood of your wounded turning into dead is much higher. The combination of the above factors leads to the regular dismantling of assault troops into trash without them achieving any significant results. At the same time, more or less trained detachments also suffer heavy losses, with the only difference being that the remnants of such detachments periodically still reach contact lines and take at least someone with them. I am aware of the specific attitude of the Army Command towards these detachments and understand perfectly well that these are essentially penal companies. However, if we put the lyrics aside, we in fact have a frankly irrational use and ineffective waste of a sufficiently motivated human resource. So the idea here is that actually these penal, these convict troops are sufficiently motivated. You know, they're getting out of prison, they're motivated enough to do the job at hand. They are just completely hamstrung by all these other variables that lead to, 40 to 70% irretrievable losses. Yeah. Right, speaking of just one more element of a loss, here's a Russian Me-2. It's crashed in Yakutia in Russia. I don't know what that means really, and it doesn't even particularly look like a military helicopter, but, these helicopters going down, I expect good news for the Ukrainians, as in they can't be used for any kind of military purpose or to support any war effort, but it also might be a result of sanctions, a lack of maintenance. All sorts of things can be derived from these news nuggets, or it could just be completely irrelevant. The Russian Ministry of Defense reports are moving on to distant strikes, reports intercepting 8 Storm Shadow Scalp EG cruise missiles fired at Sevastopol yesterday. So this is actually 2 days ago, where I reported that there were potentially ATACMS and cruise missiles fired at Crimea, arguably 3 S-400 launchers perhaps taken out in Cape Tarkankut, and other positions in Crimea hit. Well, the Russians are claiming that they've taken down 8 cruise missiles. Problem is for that claim is that they've got no evidence of doing that previously, and in fact I think even Ben Wallace let out that the Storm Shadow cruise missiles had almost complete success in Ukraine, although that was some months ago now, maybe 6 weeks ago or something like that. But he let out that I think, the intimation was that one might have misfired and gone off somewhere else, but basically they've been completely successful. So there's no evidence that Russia is able to shoot these down. But they are claiming to have shot 8 down in one night. Now, have they got some new capability, air defense capability? Don't know. Ukraine War latest in Kiev Independent talks about this. Ukrainian forces struck a strategic air defense facility on the western coast of Russian-occupied Crimea overnight on the 30th. The Ukrainian Military Center for Strategic Communications reported, and that was apparently by ATACMS. Earlier the same day, the Russian telegram channel Astra claimed that a Ukrainian missile strike hit a base of Russian air defense forces near the village of Olenivka in the western part of Crimea. According to Astra's sources, the attack allegedly injured 17 soldiers and damaged 5 military vehicles. The Center for Strategic Communications didn't provide any details on casualties and damages in the strike, as well as the type of weaponry used. In the same report, Ukraine's military said on October the 25th, strike near occupied Luhansk hit a Russian S-400 air defense system. Right. Later, the Russian Defense Ministry claimed its forces shot down 8 Storm Shadow missiles allegedly launched by Ukraine at Russian-occupied Crimea, apparently in a separate incident. Kiev hasn't commented on the incident. Local pro-Ukrainian telegram channel Crimean Wind reported several explosions in Sevastopol at around 12 p.m. local time. Residents confirmed the information on the explosions to the Ukrainian media outlet Suspilne. Russian forces reportedly deployed a smoke screen over Sevastopol Bay at the time of the attack. After it disappeared, pillars of smoke appeared over a local seaport and the Gollandia district, which hosts many military facilities, according to Crimean Wind. Kiev Independent couldn't immediately verify these claims. Explosions also occurred in Saki, that's an airbase, on Crimea's western coast, followed by electricity cutoffs in the city, Suspilna, Crimea wrote, citing residents. So we don't know what happened. Likelihood of Russia shooting down 8 Storm Shadows is very low indeed. It could have happened. It's more likely that some targets were hit. We just don't know what they are. So it's interesting because previously we've had information about cruise missile hits. Russians seem to have tightened up on letting footage escape from these sort of places. I don't know whether that means they didn't hit or whether operational security is just a bit tighter. Not that it's an operation, it's not operational security, not quite the right word, but you know what I mean. Here we have Max 23 saying the S-300 anti-aircraft missile system was damaged as a result of a missile attack on Crimea on October the 30th. According to Astra sources, a missile attack took place on the 30th at around 6 a.m. in the area of the village of Molochnia in the Saki region, and its Crimea air defense complex of the Russian Ministry of Defense is stationed there. As a result of the attack, and the S-300 air defense system was damaged and the diesel generator destroyed. Preliminary, there were no casualties. So that's coming from sources within Crimea. But again, take that with a pinch of salt, given they are not Ukrainian sources, but then you'd take Ukrainian sources as well with a pinch of salt. Anyway, last night, residents report explosions in Sloviansk. That's behind Bakhmut. You've got Kramatorsk, Sloviansk, and Konstantinivka. There were explosions there, probably S-300 missiles, but that's just me guessing. And Kryvyi Rih, further down to the south, that's Zelensky's hometown. Again, explosions reported there. And then we have those with me last night would have read about an explosion in Mirod, the attack drones in the south. So there were drones and there was a missile. Thankfully, Ukraine shot down a Kh-59 guided missile, presumably in Mirod, and 2 drones with no reports of objects hitting targets or injuries or damage. So again, another night of not very widespread missile and drone attacks on Ukraine, just some dotted here and there. Again, probably indicating a sounding out of Ukrainian air defenses and radars and whatnot. On to other bits and pieces, and here we join the Kiev Independent. They are saying, according to an expert, Russia has sent over 8,300 Ukrainian children to re-education camps in 2023. This is pretty much what Putin and one of his cabinet or one of the Kremlin politicians have been issued an arrest warrant by the ICC over. Russia forcibly sent at least 8,330 Ukrainian children to the so-called re-education camps this year for the purposes of political indoctrination and militarization. Ukrinform reported on the 30th, citing human rights expert Katerina Rashevska. These facilities, posing as rehabilitation institutions, are part of Moscow's strategy to eradicate the Ukrainian identity, the head of the NGO Regional Center for Human Rights has said. And of course, we can argue about the number of children. Some Ukrainian claims are that 20,000 children have been abducted in similar ways. That's what the Ukrainians are saying. Others are reporting different numbers. But I think what is incontrovertible is that this has happened and is happening, and the Russians seem to openly admit it as well, as a kind of like claim that they are saving these children. It's just pretty horrific, and you just hope that they get reunited. It's probably better that I then go on to this next piece, which I think is interesting. So the idea that the Russians are trying to eradicate Ukrainian identity and culture. Well, a study's come out saying the Ukrainian language has a growing dominance on social media. The Ukrainian language is taking a decisive lead over Russian on social media networks, a study by the Content Analysis Center has said. So the Ukrainian language, the study compared posts from October 2023 to posts in 2022 and 2020. Western social networks such as Facebook, X, and Instagram highlight the growth of the Ukrainian language. Yes, more than 90% of posts on Instagram are now written in the official language, the study said. According to the study's findings, 75 to 80% of posts on Facebook are written in Ukrainian, up from 65 to 70% last year. Earlier analysis from October 2020 found that only 15 to 25% of posts were in Ukrainian. While Ukrainian was made the country's only official language following independence in 1991, Russian remained widely spoken throughout the eastern and southern regions. So this is within Ukraine, but it shows a growing desire for Ukrainians to embrace their own language as a kind of rebuttal to the Russian influence on the country. And I think this will only help Ukraine establish itself in more robustly in the face of Russian aggression, cultural aggression. Now, I reported from Anton Gerashchenko, interestingly, saying that Putin, there are lots of claims about Putin having died, having had a heart attack, and so on and so forth. Russians themselves spreading these rumors. And then it appears he's come out yesterday. Putin alluded that a mob in Makhachkala was caused by mysterious foreign powers aimed to destabilize and divide Russia. Quote, at a recent meeting with the leaders of religious organizations, as you know, I already spoke about attempts to use the dramatic situation in the Middle East and other regional conflicts against our country, against Russia, to destabilize and divide a multi-ethnic and multi-confessional society for the purpose, as we see various means are being used, lies, provocations, and sophisticated technologies of psychological and information aggression. Is he talking about Russia here? I'm fairly sure he's talking about Russia. Anyway, lots of people in response to this is, which Putin is this one? Don't ask if Putin died, ask which Putin died. Now, I've reported on this before. I'm pretty sure there is a body double involved, especially when you look at this one below. So this Putin, when you see footage of that one, particularly from years gone by, it definitely looks like a different Putin. But I don't want to get too conspiratorial. I'm dead against that kind of thinking. But I'm fairly sure there's body doubles, especially when you see behavior. So there's a Putin that has gone to like Baratia. Did he go to Baratia recently and was hugging people in crowds? And then you see Putin speaking to religious leaders in the Kremlin recently, sitting at that square set of tables. He's on his own, which is miles away from anyone, or from that long table we see him sitting at, where he's right down the other end because he's got health worries that probably came out of, you know, the idea that he has cancer, perhaps other things, but also COVID. He was absolutely petrified of COVID. People had to go through spray tents before they went into his area of the palace during the COVID epidemic. So there are two behaviors of Putin, as well as several looks to Putin as well. But again, I don't want to get too out there. However, lots of people are talking about this, and in this thread, I know it goes off on one in a number of places, but you get a lot of people saying, you know, which Putin is it that has died, or, you know, which Putin is it that's saying this, so on and so forth. I don't know. I'll put that out there. I don't know. Could one of the Putins have had a heart attack? Possibly. Yeah. Right. There's this Time magazine article that has caused quite a bit of controversy. Right, let's pop into this Time article that has caused quite a bit of controversy. It's written by someone who has, in their previous writing, not been particularly pro-Ukrainian, so that's the context you might need to know to understand maybe where it's going. It's more of a down piece on Ukrainian politics and their situation. It's titled "Nobody Believes in Our Victory Like I Do" inside Vladimir Zelensky's struggle to keep Ukraine in the fight. I'm just going to go into a few bits and pieces. He famously on the front cover of Time, he says, "Nobody believes in our victory like I do. Nobody. It's been nearly 2 years. Russia still controls a fifth of Ukraine's territory. Tens of thousands have been killed. Global support for the war is shrinking. The lonely fight for Volodymyr Zelensky." So you can see how it's being framed there. So some of the pertinent points: public support for aid to Ukraine has been in decline for 4 months in the US, and Zelensky's visit did nothing to revive it. Some 41% of Americans want Congress to provide more weapons to Kyiv, down from 65% in June, when Ukraine began a major counteroffensive, according to Reuters survey taken shortly after Zelensky's departure. That offensive has proceeded at an excruciating pace and with enormous losses, making it ever more difficult for Zelensky to convince partners that victory is around the corner. With the outbreak of war in Israel, even keeping the world's attention on Ukraine has become a major challenge. While there are elements of that is true, the idea that the offensive has proceeded at an excruciating pace and with enormous losses, I would like to know how that is evaluated. Enormous losses for the Russians have taken huge losses. Ukrainians have taken big losses, but would you term that enormous losses? That seems to me rather problematic. And again, it's about framing this all as a big failure. So the author says, I asked one member of his circle. So a lot of this article is supposedly talking to inner circle members of Volodymyr's sort of aides and whatnot. I asked one member of his circle how the president was feeling. The responses coming back from America came without a second's hesitation: angry. The usual sparkle of his optimism, his sense of humour, his tendency to liven up a meeting in the war room with a bit of banter or a bawdy joke, none of that has survived into the second year of an all-out war. Quote, now he walks in, gets the updates, gives the orders and walks out, says one longtime member of his team. Another tells me that, most of all, Zelensky feels betrayed by his Western allies. They have left him without the means to win the war, only the means to survive it. If that's true, that well, one, it wouldn't surprise me. Goodness me, trying to keep upbeat after coming on for 2 years of being on a war footing and, you know, having your life threatened on a daily basis. Just, I mean, it's incredible that he does what he does. I'm interested to know what he really thinks about Western aid and feeling whether, because I get a sense of this, like, if you, and many of the commenters on my threads, like, if the US had given ATACMS, F-16s and European allies and whatnot, if allies had given all of this stuff early doors, much earlier, then perhaps we would be in a very different situation, etc., etc., etc. Right, goes on then to talk about corruption, but before we get to the corruption part, let's look at the sort of counteroffensive. Before the winter sets in, his aides warned me to expect major changes in their military strategy and a major shake-up in the president's team. At least one minister would need to be fired, along with a senior general in charge of the counteroffensive, they said. I mean, who could that be? One wonders, would it be Zaluzhny, or is this just a load of nonsense? To ensure accountability for Ukraine's slow progress at the front. Quote, we're not moving forward, says one of Zelensky's close aides. Some frontline commanders, he continues, have begun refusing orders to advance, even when they came directly from the office of the president. They just want to sit in the trenches and hold the line, he says. But we can't win a war that way. When I raised these claims with a senior military officer, he said that some commanders have little choice in second-guessing orders from the top. At one point in early October, he said the political leadership in Kyiv demanded an operation to, quote, retake, end quote, the city of Horlivka, a strategic outpost in eastern Ukraine that the Russians have held and fiercely defended for nearly a decade. The answer came back in the form of a question. With what? Quote, they don't have the men or the weapons, says the officer. Where are the weapons? Where is the artillery? Where are the new recruits? In some branches of the military, the shortage of personnel has become even more dire, with a deficit in arms and ammunition. One of Zelensky's close aides tells me that even if the US and its allies come through with all the weapons they have pledged, quote, we don't have the men to use them. Since the start of the invasion, Ukraine has refused to release official counts of dead and wounded, but according to US and European estimates, the toll has long surpassed 100,000 on each side of the war. It has eroded the ranks of Ukraine's armed forces so badly that draft officers have been forced to call up even older personnel, raising the average age of the soldier in Ukraine to around 43 years. Quote, they're grown men now, and they aren't that healthy to begin with, says the close aid to Zelensky. That is Ukraine, not Scandinavia. What was the song? Was it Hardcastle? Vietnam, the average age of an American soldier was 17. No, in World War II, the average age of an American soldier is 26. In Vietnam, is 17 or 19. Whatever. Goodness me, I'm going to have to go and find that song now. Of course, it was 19, not 17, and it was Hardcastle. Wow, Paul Hardcastle, who did the theme tune to Beverly Hills Cop, did he not? Anyway, 19. No, 19. Anyway, that is relevant to this because 43 years is somewhat different, right? And that is a huge difference. The picture looked different at the outset of the invasion. One branch of the military, known as the Territorial Defense Forces, reported accepting 100,000 new recruits in the first 10 days of the all-out war. The mass mobilization was fueled in part by the optimistic predictions of some senior officials that the war would be won in months, if not weeks. Many people thought that they could sign up for a quick tour and take part in a heroic victory, says a second member of the president's team. Now recruitment is way down as conscription efforts have intensified around the country. Stories are spreading on social media of draft officers pulling men off trains and buses and sending them to the front. Those with means sometimes bribe their way out of service, often by paying for a medical exemption. Such episodes of corruption within the recruitment system became so widespread that by the end of the summer, on August the 11th, Zelensky fired the heads of the draft officers in every region of the country. It goes on to talk about corruption. As news of these scandals spread, the president gets, I'm missing out some bits here, gave strict orders for his staff to avoid the slightest perception of self-enrichment. Quote, don't buy anything, don't take any vacations, just sit at your desk, be quiet and work. One staffer says in characterizing these directives. Some mid-level officials in the administration complained to me of bureaucratic paralysis and low morale in the scrutiny of their work as the scrutiny of their work intensified. Talks about salaries of people working in government. And it goes on to say, amid all the pressure to root out corruption, I assumed perhaps naively that officials in Ukraine would think twice before taking a bribe or pocketing state funds. But when I made this point to a top presidential advisor in early October, she asked me to turn off my audio recorder so she could speak more freely. Quote, Simon, you're mistaken, he says. People are stealing like there's no tomorrow. When I asked Zelensky, so it goes on to talk about Alexei Reznikov. When I asked Zelensky about the problem, he acknowledged its gravity and the threat it poses to Ukraine's morale and its relationship with foreign partners. Fighting corruption, he assured me, is among the top priorities. He also suggested that some foreign allies have an incentive to exaggerate the problem because it gives them an excuse to cut off financial support. It's not right, he says, for them to cover up their failure to help Ukraine by tossing out those accusations. That's a really interesting nugget thrown in there, that actually other nations would be using that as an excuse not to help out. But it was also just finally this excerpt here, paragraph, but it is also an acknowledgement that on its own Ukraine aid no longer stands much of a chance in Washington. When asked Zelensky about this, he admitted that Biden's hands appear to be tied by GOP opposition. The White House, he said, remains committed to helping Ukraine, but arguments about shared values no longer have much sway over American politicians or the people who elect them. Politics is like that, he tells me with a tired smile. They weigh their own interests, which of course they will do. But I think it gives you an indication, if true, that, Zelensky knows that it's going to be difficult to get continuous aid from the US given such partisan splits. Right, moving on from the Time article, more evidence of Russian war crimes. The Russians shot Ukrainian captured soldiers of the National Guard in the Zaporizhia area. The fighters had their hands tied behind their backs and then shot. I can't show you images, but the images are there. Again, all those pro-Kremlin voices in my threads. Do you support war crimes? Like Clive Engel and all these people that I really have no time for because I think they're moral monsters. Just out of interest, is this what you support? Do you support war crimes? Because, look, I can show you evidence there if you want. Do you support war crimes? If not, how about you shout about them rather than shout about how wonderful Russia are? Anyway, The Kiev Independent. Russian investigators claim 2 soldiers arrested over Volnovakha killings. So this is the Russians pretty much admitting that war crimes are taking place, as 9 people, an entire family, were shot in Volnovakha. Those photos have come out. I've seen them. They're horrific, and it's horrible. The Russian Investigative Committee claimed that 2 Russian soldiers have been arrested on October the 30th in connection with the murder of all 9 members of the Ukrainian family in occupied Volnovakha. The 2 soldiers in question were identified as contract personnel from Russia's Far East, the report said. Oh, how lucky we've got some ethnic minorities from the Far East of Russia as responsible. I'm not saying they weren't, but do you know what I mean? And I think, according to the report, that they're trying to blame the Ukrainians as well, because they're kind of saying that there was it alcohol, illegal alcohol being provided? Was it something to do with this family? And that's why they went and shot those kids, you know, because that's what you do. Anyway, yeah, at least something's been done, but it looks like it's been done in a way that doesn't implicate Russia as much as it can be the case. Right, Anton Gerashchenko here commenting, the head of Russian Dagestan. So I did a whole video, I've written an article. By the way, you can go and see my article. You can see my article in Only Sky. Tell us where the Jews are. History coins a terrifying rhyme. It's about the pogroms in Makhachkala, where, you know, they were trying to round up Jews, and it was pretty horrific. So that article is there for you if you go and find it. I've written a post on it on my community tab, so you can check it out there. Anyway, talking about this, Gerashchenko said head of Russian Dagestan offered those detained in the airport to join the special military operation to wash away their shame. He said there would be no forgiveness for anyone. According to reports from various Telegram channels, a mob of about 1,500 people stormed the airport, and reportedly almost 60 were detained. The damage to the airport after the riots is estimated in several million rubles. Equipment, infrastructure, facilities were damaged, cameras and fences were broken. Airport director said, quote, Putin will hold a big meeting following the events in Makhachkala. He is still receiving detailed reports on the situation in Dagestan from the FSB and National Guard of Russia and the head of the Republic. According to Dmitry Peskov, the Kremlin wants to appear like it has the situation under control. Whether that is entirely true, time will tell. So you might see some of those people end up on the front line. Some people saying yesterday how interesting it was that all of those people at the airport were young males. And you're thinking, well, there's really quite a lot of young males that would be up for mobilization and sending to Ukraine, irrespective of the wrongs they have or haven't done. Nonetheless, that's the end of today's video. Thank you so much for watching. Please like, subscribe, and share. Sorry, it's a long one. I had to dip into that Time magazine in some depth because so many people are talking about it. Take care. Speak to you soon.